Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow James, Diep, and little Nye on a meaningful journey to Sapa, a trip that takes them far beyond crowded streets and daily routines, all the way up toward the clouds. What begins as a simple family getaway slowly turns into a quiet emotional awakening, where each step on the mountain reveals something deeper about time. From misty mornings and gentle village paths to shared laughter beneath the stars, this trip isn't just about reaching a destination. It's about learning how to slow down, stay until the end to feel the calm, warmth, and subtle changes that only a place like Sapa can bring. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. Nye's voice suddenly broke through the quiet morning like a small bell, ringing again and again, playful but filled with determination. "Uncle James, you promised, right? You're really coming with us to Sapa." She stood on her chair, leaning far over the dining table, her fingers gripping the edge as if the answer might slip away if she let go. Her eyes shone brightly, carrying a mix of excitement and fear that only children had. The fear that adults might change their minds at the last second. James froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The aroma of breakfast still lingered in the air, but his thoughts drifted instinctively to work notifications waiting on his phone. Meetings, deadlines, things that always seemed urgent. He glanced at Diep, who was calmly folding Nie's scarf, her movements slow and gentle, as if she already knew what this moment meant. Diep spoke softly, not wanting to corner him. "It's really okay if you're busy. Nye and I can go by ourselves. We'll take lots of pictures and show you when we're back." Before James could respond, Nie shook her head so hard her hair bounced. "No, Uncle James has to go. We're climbing the mountain together." She stretched her arms upward, standing as tall as she could. "Fansipan is the highest mountain. Teacher said it's above the clouds, above the sky." James smiled faintly. Above the sky might be a little much. "But above the clouds is real," Nye insisted. "I want Uncle James to see the clouds with me." The room went quiet. James lowered his cup and stared at the surface of the table. He remembered how many times he had said, "next weekend," or "when work slows down." He remembered Nye being smaller, asking simpler questions, and how quickly time seemed to move without waiting for him. Nie's voice softened, becoming almost careful. "I only get one day off school each week. If you don't come now, it'll be a long time again." That was enough. James felt something loosen in his chest. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then pushed it aside. "All right," he said quietly. "Uncle James is coming." For a split second, Nye froze. Then she squealed, laughing loudly as she jumped into his arms. "Yay! Uncle James is coming with me." She hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck with surprising strength. James laughed, instinctively holding her close. Diep looked up, surprise flashing across her face before settling into relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm but restrained. The atmosphere changed instantly. Breakfast felt lighter. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed less aggressive. James noticed how relaxed his shoulders felt, as if something heavy had quietly slipped away. They left early, while the city was still half asleep. The sky was pale, streets calm. Nee pressed her face to the car window, pointing at everything. Motorcycles, street vendors setting up stalls, stray cats stretching lazily in doorways. "Are we far?" she asked for the third time. "Still a while," Diep replied patiently. James watched the city fade behind them. Buildings turned into trees, traffic into winding roads. With every kilometer, the noise in his head softened. As they climbed higher into the mountains, mist appeared, drifting across the road like thin white fabric. The air grew cooler, fresher. "It smells different," James said. Diep nodded. "That's Sapa, cold, clean, and quiet." When they finally arrived, the town greeted them with fog and silence. Wooden houses peeked through the mist, and small cafes glowed faintly behind steamed-up windows. Nee shivered, then laughed. "It's cold. Uncle James, your nose is red." James pulled his scarf tighter. "That means I belong here now." They walked slowly through the streets, their footsteps soft against the pavement. Mountains surrounded the town on all sides, their peaks hidden behind thick clouds. "It feels like time slows down here," James said. "That's why people love it," Diep replied. "You can breathe." The cable car station stood tall at the edge of the mountain. Thick cables stretched upward, disappearing into the clouds. Nye stared up in awe. "We're really going up there." James crouched beside her. "Are you scared?" She thought for a moment. "A little, but you're here." Those words stayed with him as they stepped into the cable car. The doors closed with a low hum, and slowly the ground began to fall away. Trees shrank beneath them, turning into soft green layers. Clouds brushed against the glass. "We're flying!" Nye shouted. James laughed. "It feels like it." Higher and higher they rose. The world below became smaller, quieter. James felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, work trying to follow him, but he didn't check. For once, it didn't matter. When they reached the top station, cold wind greeted them immediately. Mist clung to their clothes. Diep carefully adjusted Nye's hat and gloves. "Slow steps," she reminded. "The air is thinner up here." They climbed gradually. Nye counted the steps until she lost count and burst into laughter. James stayed close, steadying her when the stairs grew steep. Flags fluttered loudly. Bells chimed in the wind. Everyone around them moved quietly, as if instinctively respecting the mountain. At the clearing near the peak, the clouds began to part. Nye gasped, "Uncle James, we're above everything." Before them stretched endless layers of mountains, peaks floating in a sea of clouds. Sunlight broke through, painting the sky with soft gold. James stood still. He had seen many impressive views before, but none felt like this. This was calm. This was honest. Diep watched him closely. "Beautiful, right?" He nodded slowly. "I didn't know I needed this." Nee tugged his sleeve. "Take a picture with me." They stood together, wind tugging at their clothes. Nye smiling brightly, James smiling without effort. Diep captured the moment. Laughter, clouds, silence. They sat down, sharing warm tea from a thermos. Steam rose and disappeared into the sky. "When I grow up," Nye said seriously, "I want to climb mountains every weekend." James chuckled. "Every weekend?" She nodded. "You can come too, even if you're busy." He looked at her, then at the endless sky. "I'll try not to be too busy." As the wind grew stronger, Diep suggested heading back. Nye agreed reluctantly, glancing back one last time. On the way down, James felt lighter. Not because work was gone, but because it finally felt smaller than moments like this. As evening settled over Sapa, lanterns glowed softly. Nye walked between them, swinging their hands and humming a tune she had just invented. "This is my mountain song," she said proudly. James laughed. "I think Sappa likes it." They continued walking into the mist, the mountains fading behind them, but the warmth staying close, quiet, steady, and unforgettable. Morning in Sapa arrived without sunlight. It came wrapped in fog and cold air, creeping quietly through wooden walls and narrow streets. James woke up slowly, not because of any sound, but because his body felt unusually rested. He lay still for a long moment, eyes open, listening to the silence around him. No traffic, no phone buzzing, no reminders of unfinished work pulling at his thoughts. He turned his head. Nye was still asleep beside him, curled into a small shape under the thick blanket. One of her hands clutched the strap of her backpack, her fingers wrapped tightly as if she might lose it in her sleep. Her face was peaceful, unguarded, completely unaware of time. James watched her breathe, slow and steady, and felt something tighten gently in his chest. He realized how rarely he'd been present for mornings like this. Mornings without rushing, without planning the next hour before the current one even began. Across the room, Diep was already awake. She sat by the window with a cup of hot tea held between both hands, the steam rising softly into the cold air. Outside, the fog drifted past pine trees, making them appear and disappear like shadows. When she noticed James was awake, she smiled quietly. "Good morning," she said. "Did you sleep well?" James nodded. "I did, better than I expected." He hesitated, then added, "My head feels clear." Diep smiled faintly. "Sapa has that effect. It forces people to slow down." They woke Nye gently. The moment her eyes opened, she sat up too quickly, panic flashing across her face. "We're still here, right?" she asked, her voice urgent. James chuckled softly. "Still here. We're not leaving today." Nye relaxed instantly. She jumped out of bed and ran straight to the window, pressing her face against the glass. "The clouds are still here," she said happily. They didn't disappear. After breakfast, at a small local cafe, warm bread, eggs, and steaming milk tea, they stepped outside. The fog was beginning to thin, revealing the mountains one layer at a time. The air was cold enough to sting, but clean enough to make every breath feel refreshing. They avoided the main street and followed a narrow path between wooden houses. Smoke drifted from kitchen chimneys, carrying the scent of burning wood and cooked rice. Locals moved slowly, greeting them with gentle nods and quiet smiles. Nye's curiosity returned immediately. Why are the houses made of wood? Why does everyone walk so slowly? Do the clouds stay here forever? Diep answered patiently, sometimes explaining, sometimes laughing when she didn't know. James mostly listened. He noticed how relaxed Diep seemed here. No checking the time, no rushing Nye along. She was fully present. They reached a viewpoint overlooking a wide valley. Terraced fields stretched endlessly below them. carved into the mountains like giant steps. Farmers moved quietly in the distance, their figures small against the vast land. James let out a long breath. This place makes everything feel smaller. Diep nodded, even worries. Nye crouched down and picked up a small stone, turning it over in her palm. "If I throw this," she asked, "will it reach the bottom?" James knelt beside her. "Probably not, but you can try." She threw it with all her strength, watching as it disappeared into the fog. She didn't look disappointed, only thoughtful, as if wondering where it might land. Later that morning, they walked toward a small village outside town. The path was uneven, and James offered to carry Nye, but she shook her head firmly. "I want to walk," she said seriously. "I can do it myself." James stayed just a step behind her, ready to catch her if she slipped. Each careful step she took felt important. He realized how rarely he had been present for moments like this. Moments that seemed ordinary, yet quietly shaped who she was becoming. In the village, children were playing near the road, their laughter echoing through the mountains. Nye stopped walking, watching them shyly. One of the children noticed her and waved. Nye hesitated, then waved back. "Can I go say hi?" she asked. Diep smiled. "Of course. We'll be right here." James felt a flicker of nervousness as Nye approached them, but it faded quickly. Despite not sharing the same language, the children welcomed her easily. They ran, laughed, pointed, and made up games without words. James turned to Diep. "She's braver than I ever was." Diep replied softly, "Children are brave when they feel safe." Nye ran back later, cheeks red, eyes shining. "They're nice. They taught me a new game." James smiled. "Did you have fun?" She nodded eagerly. "Can we come back someday?" He paused, then answered firmly, "Yes, we will." By the time they left the village, the sun had risen higher, and the fog continued to retreat. James glanced back at the winding path, feeling something settle inside him. A quiet certainty that this trip was changing more than just his schedule. Nye walked a few steps ahead, stopping often to examine leaves, stones, and tiny flowers growing stubbornly through cracks in the soil. "Uncle James!" she called out, holding up a small white flower. "It's still alive even though it's cold." James crouched beside her. "That means it's strong." She thought about that for a moment, then nodded seriously and tucked the flower carefully into her pocket. They followed the trail higher, not toward Fansipan's peak this time, but along a gentler route recommended by a local earlier that morning. The path curved through pine trees and open hillsides, revealing new views every few minutes. Sometimes the valley stretched wide below them. Sometimes the clouds drifted close enough to touch. Diep walked quietly beside James. After a while, she spoke. "You seem different here." James smiled faintly. "I feel different." "In a good way?" He nodded. "In a way that makes me realize how loud my life usually is." They stopped at a small clearing where flat rocks formed natural seats. James handed out water and snacks. Nye sat between them, swinging her legs happily. "Do you think the clouds get tired of moving?" she asked suddenly. Diep laughed softly. "Maybe, but they don't have a choice." James looked at the clouds rolling slowly across the mountains. "Maybe that's okay. Moving doesn't always mean rushing." After resting, They continued until the trail began to slope downward again. The hike wasn't long, but it was enough to leave Nee pleasantly tired. Her steps slowed, and she reached out to hold James's hand without saying anything. He tightened his grip gently, feeling the warmth of her small fingers. By mid-afternoon, they returned to town. Sapa was livelier now, with more visitors filling the streets, but it still felt calm compared to the city. They wandered through a small local market where vendors sold handmade scarves, dried herbs, and simple souvenirs. Nee pointed at everything. That hat is funny. That scarf is bigger than me. Can we buy something for home? Diep chose a thick scarf for Nee and a small woven bracelet. James paid without thinking, then paused, realizing how rare it was for him to make decisions without calculating time or efficiency.